At 4:30 in the morning on October 14th, 1942, Captain Dale Brannon was lying flat in a mud-filled foxhole on Guadalcanal, his face pressed into the earth, helmet grinding into the dirt, as if he could bury himself deep enough to survive what was happening. The island was not just trembling. The soil beneath him felt as though it had turned to liquid. Every few seconds, a blast wave slammed into his body, crushing his chest so hard it felt like a giant fist driving the air from his lungs. This was not an air raid. No bombers droned overhead. No mortar crews were lobbing shells from the jungle. The destruction came from the sea. Out in the darkness of the slot, two Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, moved back and forth along the coast with slow confidence, like predators circling helpless prey. Their 14-inch guns fired high explosive shells straight into Henderson Field. Each round was enormous, built to smash through the armored sides of heavy cruisers. Instead, those same shells were tearing into canvas tents, fuel reserves, and rows of parked aircraft. When they hit, they did not simply leave holes. Entire sections of ground vanished. Coral and dirt exploded upward. The air filled with the stench of burning aviation fuel, pulverized coral dust, and that sharp metallic smell that comes when men are too afraid to speak. For the Marines and pilots crouched in their muddy holes, this was the lowest point imaginable. They called the island the Canal. That night it felt like a cemetery. Supplies were scarce. Malaria was spreading through the ranks, and the United States Navy was nowhere near enough to protect them. After dark, the Japanese controlled everything. Their ships could approach the shoreline at will. They called their nightly supply runs the Tokyo Express, bringing fresh troops, ammunition, and artillery to grind the Americans down. When daylight finally broke over what remained of Henderson Field, the quiet that followed was almost worse than the shelling. Brannon and the other pilots from the 67th Fighter Squadron dragged themselves out of their foxholes, stiff and dazed, and stared at the damage. The runway looked like the surface of the moon, crater after crater carved into it. Many of the aircraft were reduced to twisted, burning wreckage. The fuel storage area had been obliterated. The radio tower was nothing but shattered wood and splinters. Yet in the middle of the devastation, almost impossibly untouched, sat their own planes. They were not the famous P-51 Mustang. They were not the sleek, high-altitude Corsair. They were Bell P-39 Airacobras, and the men assigned to fly them despised every one of them. To the pilots, the P-39 did not feel like a weapon. It felt like a cruel joke from an engineer who enjoyed watching others suffer. They called it the Cobra. It was a clunker, the sort of aircraft handed to a squadron no one cared about. Even parked on the strip, it looked wrong. It rested on tricycle landing gear, with a nose like a child's toy, sitting level and flat, while most other fighters stood with their noses angled upward. It looked small. It looked awkward. But its appearance was not the real issue. The strangeness began the moment you tried to get inside. In most World War II fighters, you climbed up, slid the canopy back, and dropped into the cockpit like a racing driver. The Airacobra did not work that way. It had a door. A solid, steel-framed door with a roll-down window, like something from a 1930s automobile. You did not climb in. You opened it, stepped inside, sat down, and shut the door against your shoulder. It made you feel boxed in, like you were sealed inside a flying booth. In an emergency, you could not simply slide the canopy back and leap clear. You had to unlatch that heavy door and force it open against the wind. If you mistimed it, the slipstream would slam the door back with violent force. And that was only the beginning of its problems. In a conventional fighter, the engine sits in front, pulling the aircraft forward and acting as a shield between the pilot and enemy fire. The P-39 was different. Its nose was largely empty. The Allison V1710 engine was mounted behind the pilot, directly at his back. It was like sitting in front of a racing car engine inside a world designed for farm trucks. A long steel drive shaft ran from that engine, beneath the pilot's seat, between his legs, all the way to the propeller gearbox in the nose. During takeoff, when full power was applied, that shaft spun at thousands of revolutions per minute. The sound was high and sharp, like a dentist's drill screaming inches from a major artery. The vibrations traveled through the floor and into the control stick. It was a constant reminder that the machine beneath you could turn deadly without warning. The layout was meant to be innovative. Engineers believed concentrating the mass in the center would improve aerodynamics and maneuverability. But in Buffalo, New York, they made a critical error. With so much weight centralized, the aircraft became unstable. It was overly sensitive. Pull too aggressively on the stick, and it would not simply stall. It would tumble. It could flip end over end like a leaf caught in a violent updraft. Once the Airacobra entered a flat spin, recovery was nearly impossible. Centrifugal force would pin the pilot sideways against the door, trapping him. The aircraft would spin downward, uncontrolled, until it struck the ground. The men on Guadalcanal had their own dark humor about it. If enemy fire brought you down, you might survive. If the Cobra decided to kill you, there was nothing you could do. And the betrayal did not end with its design. It stretched back to decisions made far from the battlefield. Originally, the P-39 was intended to be a high-altitude interceptor. It was supposed to carry a turbo supercharger, a device that compressed air so the engine could breathe properly at 20,000 feet. If the aircraft had kept its turbo supercharger, the story might have been different. With that system feeding compressed air into the engine, the Airacobra could have climbed into the same altitude band as the Japanese fighters. It might have stood a chance. But before the United States entered the war, someone behind a desk decided the turbo setup cost too much and added unnecessary complexity. So they removed it. To cut expenses, they gutted the very component that would have made the airplane competitive. The consequences were brutal. At low altitude, under 10,000 feet, the P-39 performed well enough. It was quick and responsive. But once it climbed past roughly 12,000 feet, the engine began to choke. Power dropped off sharply. The motor struggled, starved for oxygen. Above that level, the aircraft turned into a heavy, reluctant machine that fought to remain airborne. In the Pacific, that weakness was lethal. The Mitsubishi Zero was the opposite. Light as a kite, built with thin metal and wide wings, it thrived high in the sky. Japanese pilots cruised comfortably at 20,000 feet, watching the American P-39s crawling below them. They chose when to attack. They would dive from the sun, strike fast, then climb back to altitude before the Americans could even point their noses upward. The British had already learned this lesson. In 1941, the Royal Air Force purchased a batch of Airacobras. They painted them in British markings and flew a single operational mission. After landing, the pilots climbed out and made their opinion clear. The aircraft was not fit for modern air combat. They sent the planes back. Their message to the Americans was diplomatic but unmistakable. The P-39 was not suitable for the kind of high-altitude fighting the war demanded. The United States Army Air Forces responded in the most predictable way possible. They redirected the unwanted aircraft to the harshest theater available, Guadalcanal. The men of the 67th Fighter Squadron understood exactly what that meant. They were flying what others had rejected. They knew the reputation of their aircraft. They had heard the jokes. Japanese pilots even mocked them over the radio, calling their planes slow boats. On the morning of October 14th, as smoke drifted across the shattered remains of Henderson Field, one thing was certain. The enemy would return. The Tokyo Express was still running. Reports indicated a large convoy of transports and destroyers was already moving down the slot. Thousands of fresh Japanese troops were coming to land on the beaches and drive the Marines into the ocean. Captain Brannan studied what was left of his squadron. He looked at the Airacobras parked on the damaged strip. They were ungainly. They were heavy. They lacked the ability to climb into the high-altitude fight. If they tried to meet the Zeros at 20,000 feet, the outcome was obvious. The manuals might have labeled the P-39 an interceptor, but those manuals had not been written by men standing in bomb craters on a tropical island. Brannan and his pilots understood they could not follow doctrine. If they tried to fight by the enemy's preferred rules, they would not survive. They had to rethink everything. Instead of focusing on what the aircraft could not do, they had to consider what it alone could do. Because the P-39 had one feature no other fighter possessed. The engine had been moved to the rear, not just for novelty. It had been relocated to free space in the nose for something unusual, something more at home on a tank than in a fighter. Mounted through the center line of the nose sat an Oldsmobile T9 cannon. Not a machine gun, a 37mm weapon. It fired high explosive rounds the size of a stick of butter. The system was heavy. The rate of fire was slow. Yet that cannon was the reason the Airacobra still mattered. The pilots studied the weapon, then shifted their gaze toward the ocean. For the first time, they stopped staring upward into the sky. They began looking at the water. To understand that shift, you have to understand the weapon between their knees. The Oldsmobile T9 was unlike anything else carried by a fighter in 1942. Most fighters relied on machine guns, rapid-fire weapons that spewed streams of bullets. A Browning could fire roughly 12 rounds per second, filling the air with metal and relying on sheer volume to score a hit. The T9 operated differently. It fired only about 3 rounds per second. Each discharge felt like a hammer blow. The cockpit filled with smoke. The recoil shook the airframe and rattled teeth. The cannon jammed often. Clearing it meant reaching between your legs to yank a charging handle while flying at 300 miles per hour. It was awkward and dangerous, but its shells were high explosive. One direct hit could tear apart a wing or rip open a fuselage. There was no need for sustained fire. A single impact could be decisive. As the pilots watched Japanese ships move along the coast, a realization took shape. Everything they despised about the P-39 might actually serve a purpose. The heavy nose, the engine tuned for low altitude, the slow, powerful cannon. They had been trying to force the aircraft into the role of a high-altitude interceptor, which was as misguided as using a sledgehammer to swat an insect. At altitude, the mid-engine layout made the plane unstable. It wandered and felt unpredictable. But near sea level, in the dense Pacific air, the same design produced a different effect. The aircraft became steady. It held its line through turbulence. It felt planted. When the cannon fired, the nose did not jerk wildly because the engine mass in the center absorbed much of the recoil. Down low, the Airacobra transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer an interceptor. It was a fast, stable gun platform, capable of skimming the treetops at 350 miles per hour like an armored carriage built to strike targets at sea level. At first, they moved carefully. The Cobra pilots began by hunting smaller prey. Japanese forces relied on hundreds of wooden motor barges, called daihatsus, to ferry supplies from destroyers to shore. These boats were roughly 50 feet long, crammed with sacks of rice, ammunition crates, and soldiers. They were too small to justify torpedoes and too sturdy for ordinary gunfire. A standard 50 caliber round would punch a clean hole through the wood, and the craft would keep moving as if nothing had happened. The P-39 altered that equation. The pilots learned to approach at wave-top height, flying flat and fast, aligning the dark outline of a barge in their gun sight. They held their fire. They waited until they were so close they could distinguish figures on deck. Then they squeezed the trigger. When a 37mm high explosive shell struck a wooden hull, it did not simply penetrate. It detonated within the timber itself. The first round often tore apart the bow. A second ignited fuel or ammunition. A third transformed the entire vessel into a violent burst of splinters and spray. 40-foot boats vanished in a single pass. The Americans were no longer chipping away at supply lines. They were erasing them. The Cobra had found its purpose. Confidence followed. Pilots began decorating their aircraft with painted shark mouths and jagged teeth. The mood shifted. They were no longer helpless targets in the Pacific. They had become hunters. But destroying wooden barges was one thing. Attacking warships was another. The barges carried little defense. The destroyers steaming down the slot were armored and bristling with 25mm anti-aircraft guns capable of ripping a P-39 apart in seconds. The situation escalated quickly. Japanese commanders were furious at the loss of supplies. Their barge traffic was being shredded by low-flying American fighters. So they escalated in return. Reports soon confirmed a major Tokyo Express movement. This was not routine resupply. It was an invasion convoy. Destroyers packed with troops and artillery were heading south, intent on retaking Henderson Field. The order reached the 67th Fighter Squadron with brutal clarity. Stop them. On paper, it was a suicide assignment. A handful of second-tier fighters against a naval force. Conventional wisdom said you did not attack a destroyer with a fighter unless you carried bombs. The P-39s carried none. They had the cannon. The briefing took place in the mud. The plan was bold to the point of recklessness. There would be no steep dive bombing runs. Diving left an aircraft exposed, hanging in the sky while every gunner fired upward. Instead, They would exploit the one characteristic everyone mocked. They would stay low. Late in the afternoon, the Cobras took off, their Allison engines roaring as they accelerated. They did not climb toward altitude. They leveled at 50 feet, then 20, then barely 10 feet above the water. They flew so low their propellers churned spray from the surface behind them. They traced the coastline, using the dark jungle backdrop to mask their approach. To a lookout scanning the sky, an aircraft at 10,000 feet is obvious. A dark olive plane skimming along a shadowed shoreline at 10 feet is almost invisible. It is a blur, a ghost. The squadron raced down the channel in silence. Inside the cockpits, the heat was oppressive. There was no ventilation beyond whatever air forced its way in. The long drive shaft beneath their seats radiated heat. The tropical sun beat through the canopy. Oil fumes mixed with sweat and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Then the ships appeared. Gray shapes emerged through the haze, angular and purposeful, slicing through the water. Japanese destroyers zigzagged south, white wakes trailing behind them. High above, small dark specks circled. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, Zeros waiting for dive bombers to appear from the sun. They were scanning the sky. They were not watching the water. They did not see the line of Airacobras racing across the waves at 300 miles per hour. Inside the American cockpits, hands tightened on control sticks. Pilots reached down and charged their cannons, feeling the heavy mechanical clunk as the bolt locked forward. Now the test would come. Could this awkward aircraft with its slow-firing cannon truly damage a warship? Or would the shells merely spark against steel before anti-aircraft fire tore them apart? Captain Brannan broke the silence on the radio. His tone was steady, stripped of emotion. Line them up. Aim at the waterline. Hit the bridge. Hit the gun directors. If they cannot see us, they cannot shoot us. Blind them. The squadron spread into a rough line abreast, thin aluminum machines charging directly at a wall of steel. The destroyers swelled in the windshields. Details sharpened by the second. White uniforms moved across the decks. Gun mounts rotated, searching. The advantage of surprise was evaporating. At 300 miles per hour, distance disappears instantly. The horizon does not approach slowly. It rushes outward. What had looked like small gray shapes became towering walls of steel that filled the entire canopy. This is the truth of a low-level attack. There is no altitude to climb into, no clouds to hide behind. There is only a sheet of plexiglass between you and hundreds of enemy sailors staring straight at you, fingers already tightening on triggers. At first, the Japanese gunners hesitated. Their training told them to aim upward, around 45 degrees, anticipating dive bombers dropping from the sky. They were prepared to shoot at targets descending from above, not aircraft racing in below the height of their own railings. For a few priceless seconds, their guns pointed at empty sky, while the P-39s closed beneath their arcs of fire. Then the destroyer captains shouted commands. Turrets slammed downward. The ocean in front of the Americans exploded. Not just bullets, but geysers. Shells struck the water, throwing up towering columns of white spray 50 feet high. It was no longer simple anti-aircraft fire. It was a violent artificial storm. The pilots had to weave through walls of water that could shear off a wing, all while keeping their sights locked on the ships ahead. In the lead aircraft, the long drive shaft beneath the pilot's seat vibrated furiously. The entire airframe thrummed with energy. This was the moment the Cobra stopped being a punchline. A conventional nose-heavy fighter would have bounced wildly in the thick, unstable air above the sea. The nose would pitch and climb with every disturbance. The P-39 did not. With its engine mass centered, it cut through the turbulence. It felt planted, almost immovable. The nose held steady. The pilot did not aim at the thick armored belt along the hull. A 37mm shell might scar it, but not penetrate. He aimed for weaknesses. The bridge. The glass windows of the command center. The gun mounts. The rudder controls at the stern. It required precision. A narrow margin. Threading a needle at high speed. At roughly 500 yards, he pressed the trigger. Cordite smoke flooded the cockpit. The cannon's recoil slammed through the airframe in heavy pulses. Thump, thump, thump. The projectiles were massive compared to machine gun fire. They looked like glowing red spheres streaking forward, dipping slightly before leveling out. The first round struck the water short, skipping off the surface. The second did not miss. It smashed into the superstructure just below the bridge. This was not the metallic ping of a rifle round. The shell detonated on impact, blasting through reinforced glass and exploding inside the command space. It did not need to punch through armor. The bridge erupted in smoke and fire. Black and orange burst outward from the starboard side. The blast threw officers from their positions as the command area filled with choking fumes. The 37mm round, designed to break tanks, was devastating against thinner plating. The pilot kept firing. Another shell tore into a 25mm anti-aircraft mount. A second earlier, it had been spitting tracers at him. Now it disappeared in a flash. Gunners were thrown aside. The barrel twisted and bent. The Airacobra roared over the deck, passing so low it nearly clipped the radio mast. The pilot could glance down and see chaos spreading below. Flames licking upward, men running in confusion, debris scattered across steel. Then the rest of the squadron arrived. This was not a duel. It was overwhelming force. The P-39s attacked from multiple angles, not in tidy formation, but in a loose, aggressive swarm. They struck from port, starboard, and astern. Each time Japanese gunners swung their weapons toward one attacker, another Cobra tore in from a different direction. While the lead aircraft hammered the destroyers and disrupted their defenses, the trailing pilots focused on the true objective. The barges. The destroyers were escorts. The barges carried the troops and ammunition. Slow, wooden, overloaded. They were exposed. Now the improvisation turned lethal. The Cobra pilots throttled back slightly to steady their aim. They lined up on the lumbering wooden craft, preparing to fire. A 37mm cannon was excessive against plywood hulls, but excessive was exactly what the Marines needed. One pilot walked his fire across 3 barges in line. The first shell struck the engine compartment of the lead craft. Fuel ignited instantly. The boat did not slowly sink. It came apart. A rolling fireball swept across the surface, hurling flaming timber and cargo high into the air. The second barge was hit amidships where ammunition had been stacked. The detonation was so violent the shockwave rattled the P-39 overhead. The blast rippled across the water, overturning smaller boats nearby. The slot began to resemble a scrapyard. Burning oil spread in slicks across the waves. Crates of rice, uniforms, and loose ammunition floated in the churned sea. Surviving Japanese soldiers leapt overboard, abandoning wrecked craft. The Cobras did not break off. They turned back, checked fuel, cycled their cannons, and attacked again. Pass after pass, they dismantled the landing force boat by boat. Far above, the Zeros circled helplessly. From 20,000 feet, they watched the destruction unfold. They tried to dive into the fight, but at sea level the dense air punished them. Engines ran hot. Controls stiffened. By the time they dropped low enough to engage, the P-39s were already accelerating away along the coastline, blending into jungle shadow. The Americans refused to climb. The Japanese fighters could only watch. Below, the destroyers were still afloat, but they were battered. It takes torpedoes to sink a warship, not cannon shells, yet the damage was severe. Radar sets were wrecked. Bridges were shattered. Fires burned along the decks. The 37mm rounds had not punched through armored belts, but they had crippled the ship's ability to fight. Captains looked at the flaming barges astern, then at their own damaged vessels. The objective was gone. You cannot land troops when your transport boats are splinters and smoke. A signal lamp flashed. Retreat. The gray hulls began turning north, carving wide arcs through the water. They were leaving burning wreckage behind. Soldiers were still in the sea. Supplies drifted uselessly. They were withdrawing from aircraft that had once been dismissed as scrap. Inside one Cobra cockpit, a pilot wiped sweat from his eyes. His flight suit was soaked. His fingers ached from gripping the stick. Spent brass casings from the cannon lay scattered across the floor. He glanced at the ammunition counter. Empty. Fuel gauge. Nearly critical. He banked left and looked back at the chaos stretching for miles. The Tokyo Express had been stopped. He did not feel like a knight of the sky. He felt like a demolition man finishing a brutal job. The P-39 was not elegant. It lacked the beauty of a Spitfire and the range of a Mustang. It vibrated. It was cramped. It was unconventional. But as the squadron reformed and headed toward the damaged strip at Henderson Field, they understood something. The Cobra had faced a destroyer head-on and survived. Landing gear dropped. The tricycle wheels locked into place. They returned to a cratered runway and whatever comfort could be found there, leaving fires on the horizon behind them. When the aircraft rolled to a stop, ground crews ran forward expecting leaking oil and torn metal. Instead, they found soot-blackened noses. The ammunition bays were empty. The Airacobra had not merely threatened. It had struck hard. Mechanics looked from the vacant ammo racks to the pilots climbing down with fierce, exhausted grins. No long explanation was necessary. The quiet over the airfield said enough. In the weeks that followed, the reputation of the P-39 began to change. Jokes did not disappear overnight. Pilots still complained about the cramped cockpit and the heavy door. But fear was replaced with understanding. They now knew its role. It was not a high-altitude interceptor. It was a low-altitude hammer. They used it to smash barges, rake troop columns, and harass shipping along the coast. Japanese infantry learned to recognize the low, throaty growl of its engine. That sound meant explosive shells were about to arrive at treetop height. While American pilots were slowly adjusting their opinion, Soviet aviators had already embraced the aircraft. On the Eastern Front, combat often occurred close to the ground, exactly where the P-39 excelled. Aces such as Alexander Pokrushkin ignored restrictive doctrine, used the cannon against German bombers, and transformed this rejected American fighter into one of the most effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal. Officials in Washington and London had judged it by the wrong measure. They wanted a climber and received a bruiser. Those who fought in it called it something different. They called it survival. After the war, the Airacobra did not receive the same glory as other fighters. There were no victory parades for the Airacobra. The spotlight belonged to the P-51 Mustang, polished and glamorous, the symbol of American air power. The P-39s did not receive that treatment. Most of them ended up in scrap yards. They were cut apart, melted down, turned into siding for houses or aluminum cans. They were awkward, unconventional, and easy to overlook. For a long time, they were largely forgotten. But with distance, the picture becomes clearer. The P-39 was an early example of a different way of thinking about combat aircraft. Instead of designing an airplane first and then fitting weapons onto it, engineers built this one around a gun. That idea would reappear years later in aircraft like the A-10 Warthog, another ungainly, low-flying machine centered around a massive cannon. Critics dismissed it. Soldiers trusted it. The Airacobra demonstrated something simple. Statistics on paper do not win battles. The laws of physics do. On that day over Guadalcanal, the most effective aircraft was not the one that climbed the highest. It was the one that operated where the fight actually was, low over the water, absorbing punishment and delivering it back. Stories like this matter because history often favors clean narratives. It prefers flawless machines and decisive victories. It forgets the chaotic moments when survival depended on improvisation with whatever tools were available. It forgets that while the celebrated thoroughbreds were still being refined, the Cobras were already in combat. Captain Brannan and his squadron did not end the war that afternoon. What they did was buy time. They gave the Marines another night. They interrupted the enemy's momentum. They proved that an imperfect aircraft, flown with courage and creativity, can accomplish what carefully drafted plans cannot. So when you see an image of that compact fighter with its automobile-style door and nose wheel, do not dismiss it. Think about the sound of its 37mm cannon echoing through humid Pacific air. Think about the destroyers forced to turn away. Think about the Cobra. If this exploration of overlooked World War II aircraft resonated with you, consider supporting the channel. It helps bring attention to the machines and the people that history sometimes overlooks. Subscribe for more stories about the weapons, strategies, and individuals who bent the rules to survive and prevail. I will see you in the next story.